um, is a friend of mine. He's not a good friend, but he's I guess you could say an acquaintance. He, of course, is teaching down in Texas now. But we both went to Macalester College in St. Paul. He was 1 year ahead of me. It's very ironic as I think of what he went through, being on the firing line, almost dying. He was the #1 student in his class at Macalester College, which is a pretty good school. He would probably have gone on to become a very high-powered lawyer because his major was political science, which was the primary major at Macalester, and most of those people then went on to law school. But in the end, we got this fantastic literature from him because of a twist of fate. When he comes back to Minnesota, I do get to speak with him. He came back to Macalester to read a few years ago, and actually at that point, I arranged with Mrs. Noner to get her picture taken with him, because she had taught this book previously, and so she was pretty excited when she found out about that. Much of what I say may just echo what Tim says in his book, but again, the experience was fairly universal in that age for men who were subject to the draft. And we're going to talk a lot about the draft as we go through the 45-minute period here. But first, I want to talk about some history, okay? Because I don't think that Vietnam exists just as a standalone event. In fact, I think it maybe comes out of some of what happened in World War II. So this was my dad's yearbook from the 4th Marine Division. That's what the big 4 is for. He fought on Iwo Jima, one of the bloodiest battles in history. And just a brief synopsis of World War II. It was fought on 2 fronts. In Europe, we were trying to beat Hitler and the Nazis. And in the Western Front, in the Pacific, we were trying to prevent the Japanese from expanding to land that we thought was ours. So anyway, this is fighting on Iwo Jima, trying to get an air base from which we could bomb Tokyo and try to bring Japan to its knees and surrender. As you probably know, the surrender did not come until after we dropped an atom bomb on 2 of their cities, which is still controversial to this day, although many people don't know. What's happening here is they're burning people to death. That's what that flamethrower is doing. Because the Japanese were trying to get what they believed. They wanted to win land for room for their expanding population. They were dug in at Iwo Jima after the greatest naval bombardment in history. Very few of them had even been injured because they were dug in so deeply. Has anybody ever seen the movie Flags of Our Fathers? Anybody? And it's very realistic. Clint Eastwood did a brilliant job of depicting how they're just way in there and you can't get at them. I mean, you got to go in, flamethrowers, whatever, and get them. It's very horrible. War is horrible in all of its forms. So that was one reason why I believed I should serve when I got the draft notice for Vietnam, because my dad had served honorably, and I thought, well, geez, I'm a good son. I don't want to embarrass him. So anyway, we'll talk more about that when we get to the Vietnam part. But so I'm a baby boomer. I was born in 1947 after my dad came back from the war, and what they wanted to do was get married and have children, and build a house, and all those nice things. And so the 50s seemed very quiet and peaceful, and people were generally prosperous. And we were building the interstate highway system. People could travel in their new cars. Cars of the 50s are still revered to this day, 57 Chevy and things like that. I mean, it just seemed like, wow, what a great, perfect era. Well, it wasn't really that way. There were things bubbling underneath the surface. African Americans were being mistreated in the South still. Women were still kind of second-class citizens. Anybody watch Mad Men at all? Do I, you know, if this were Mad Men, I say to Mrs. Fry, go get me a cup of coffee. Mrs. Fry, hang up my jacket. And it was almost master-servant relationship. That's how women. Matter of fact, there were not that many women in the marketplace in the job force in the 50s. So there were a number of things that were churning as we moved into the 60s. The civil rights movement, trying to win more freedom for African Americans, especially in the South. The women's movement was coming along. That was driven by the arrival of the birth control pill, which freed women from a worry that they had been subjected to for thousands and thousands of years, accidental pregnancy. And people like Betty Friedan were writing books like The Feminine Mystique. So the women's movement was gaining steam in the 60s. And rock and roll music was dividing the country. If any of you like hip-hop, I'm guessing that your parents don't like hip-hop, and maybe you have some disagreements about that. I don't. Is anybody that applies to that you like hip-hop and your parents don't? Or am I? I mean, we like rock and roll, you know, like revolutionary, but they were used to listening to Frank Sinatra and big band music and stuff like that, which I like. It's fine, but I like rock and roll too. And they didn't like that, especially when the Beatles came over with their long hair. It was like, oh my gosh, boys are having long hair now? This is shocking. And my brother, who had shoulder-length hair by about 1967, a number of times would walk into a restaurant and would hear the comment, is that a boy or is that a girl? And so there are some prejudices and tensions developing through the 60s. All of that was brought into really stark relief. November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy, the dashing, handsome, witty young president with a beautiful wife and perfect children, was shot to death in Dallas, Texas, and it sent the nation into shock and mourning. It was like, wake up from the dream of the 50s, folks. Here's the alarm clock. The world is not necessarily a nice place. Lyndon Johnson becomes president. He thinks he has a lot to prove because he's not as handsome as John F. Kennedy. He's not as, he's not cool like John F. Kennedy. He's a very powerful, brilliant politician, but he thinks he has a lot to prove. So he immediately tried to get passed what was called the Voting Rights Act, which he did succeed in doing, which was really quite miraculous. He was a Southerner, and he got some Southern people to support this rights of African Americans to vote. It was a revolutionary piece of legislation. But that wasn't still enough. And he had some really smart people advising him that were talking about the domino theory, which was that the communists will take over nations one at a time. The nation next to China will fall. That was Vietnam, by the way. And then the next nation will fall, and the next nation will fall. And pretty soon, every nation in the world, they'll be in Canada before you know it, or they'll be in Mexico before you know it. And this sounds kind of stupid to us today, right? Does that sound stupid? I don't know. It sounded stupid to me in 1969 when I got my draft notice, but I really didn't believe the domino theory. I thought it was kind of simplistic. But there were some smart people like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who believed it was true and believed that we had to oppose the communists at every turn. And therefore, since the communist government of North Vietnam was trying to depose the, really, what was a totalitarian dictatorship in South Vietnam, but they were our dictators, you know. We were friends with those dictators. We didn't like the communists, but the dictators were okay. So because they were trying to take over South Vietnam, we were sending troops there from 1959 on. 1964, August 1964, a Vietnamese patrol boat attacks an American destroyer. Doesn't do any damage, but they attacked them. They get a vote in Congress. 2 people out of the whole, 535 people in Congress? 2 people voted against what it was called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which basically said that President Lyndon Johnson could send as many troops as he wanted to try to defend South Vietnam. So, shortly thereafter, I'm not sure what the year was exactly, but there were 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. That's 10 times as many as there were at the peak of the Iraq War. We thought that was a big effort, 50,000 troops. 500,000 in Vietnam, and that meant that they needed bodies. And they were male bodies. At that time, women, there were women in the military, but very few, very few. So it was mostly a thing that affected males. And they implemented something that had been in effect since 1917, whenever we entered World War I, the draft, the military draft. And they would send you a notice, say you are required to report at such and such a date to such and such a place. It was in downtown Minneapolis for your physical. And assuming you could pass the physical, then you were subject to the draft. Now, here, I'll put myself in the category of Tim O'Brien, and really tens of thousands, maybe millions, I'm not sure, but tens of thousands for sure, of young men. And we're kind of pampered. We grew up in the 50s. We came from, prosperous families. We had gotten this high-class education. We were told that we were, God's gift to the world. We're smart. We know a lot. We have this beautiful education. And so, why do I have to go and serve in this war that I think is really wrong? And Tim O'Brien in his book says that he thinks that the war is wrong. And then in the chapter Along the Rainy River, if you remember that, I just want to quote a little bit from that. The only certainty that summer was moral confusion. When a nation goes to war, it must have reasonable confidence in the justice and imperative of that cause. Once people are dead, you can't make them undead. And then just a little bit later in that chapter, I think I lost my bookmark here, but there it is. He says, here I was, I'm up on the Rainy River. He's talking to that old guy that owns the little resort there. 21 years old, an ordinary kid with all the ordinary dreams and ambitions. All I wanted was to live the life I was born to, a mainstream life. And all of a sudden, you get your draft notice, as Tim did in June of 1968, and I did in July of 1969, and you're being told you can't live that ordinary mainstream life because of Vietnam, a war that I thought was wrong. I didn't think there was military justification for it. I didn't think there was any justification for it. But Lyndon Johnson had gotten in, and a lot of smart guys were supporting him, and the military was pushing it. And now with 500,000 troops there, it's really hard to get out of a situation like that. Then suddenly comes the year 1968, and it seems like everything is falling all apart. We had been told we were winning the war. The Vietnamese mountain was called the Tet Offensive. They take back a lot of major cities. You heard that. They take back a lot of major cities that we thought that we controlled. So all of a sudden, we are not winning the war in Vietnam. It is very, very clear. Lyndon Johnson, there's protests in the streets. Students are marching. I marched along Grand Avenue in St. Paul. I didn't say, hell no, we won't go, but I said, stop the war is wrong. A lot of people were saying, hell no, we won't go. Some people even went so far as to go to the draft board and burn their draft cards, which was really, either a courageous or stupid thing to do, depending on how you looked at it, because it was a criminal offense to do that. But anyway, Lyndon Johnson, seeing this tremendous opposition to the war rising, a senator from Minnesota, a liberal senator by the name of Eugene McCarthy, runs against Lyndon Johnson for the Democratic nomination. He is supposed to have no chance at all. He runs on one plank alone, one tenet of his campaign: stop the war in Vietnam. Nothing about economics, nothing about voting rights, nothing about anything except stop the war in Vietnam. In New Hampshire, he gets a huge turnout, almost beats Lyndon Johnson there. In Minnesota, Tim O'Brien drove voters to the polls to vote for McCarthy. I drove voters to the polls to vote for McCarthy. We wanted to stop the war in Vietnam. So Johnson sees this tremendous opposition building to the war. He goes on television late March of 1968 and he says, I will not run again. Just 4 years earlier, he had won by one of the largest margins in history. So he had gone from this huge margin of victory to say, I don't think I can win because of the war in Vietnam. It was dividing the country so badly. 1 week after Johnson announces that on television, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot dead in Memphis. 2 months after that, Bobby Kennedy, who everybody thinks will be president at some point, just like his brother was, is shot dead in Los Angeles. 2 months after that, the Democratic Convention in Chicago, Johnson said he won't run. Another senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey, is the apparent nominee of the convention. He has been supportive of Johnson because he has to be the vice president. Students show up in droves in Grant Park in Chicago across from the convention, and they're chanting, hell no, we won't go, stop the war, and a near riot breaks out when the Chicago police are sent in, and they start taking billy clubs and whacking students over the head, turning water cannons on them, using dogs, whatever. It's just like anarchy, and it's all happening on live television, because at that point, television covered the conventions live, and people are just shocked. That's what's going on. The most trusted newsman in America, Walter Cronkite, maybe you've heard of him. At that time, he was just like the most trusted figure in America. You can probably read history books that will say that. He goes on television, and at that point, journalists weren't supposed to express their opinion. They were supposed to report the facts, and that's all. Nowadays, it's popular to express your opinion. Walter Cronkite goes on national television and says, I don't think we can win this war. And Johnson reportedly said to his aides, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost the people. So he thinks the war then at that point is untenable, but he's got 500,000 troops and they can't back out. Well, they go to something called the draft lottery to try to diffuse some of the opposition, where they say that, okay, well, we'll draft people who have a lottery number below 225, 250, whatever it was. They assign the day of the year, your birthday, and then they would assign a random number, 1 through 365 to that. So if your number, I had a friend who was 325, he was safe. He didn't have to worry about the draft. He could go to grad school, go on with his life, do whatever he wanted to do. I had been accepted at law school at the University of Minnesota. My number was 166, and I was definitely below the threshold. I was going to get drafted, just like Tim O'Brien got his draft notice. So the draft notice comes, and I had become really kind of fatalistic at that point, decided, I'm just going to have fun. So I traveled some. I did take a little job to earn enough money. I was 21 at the time, so I, earned enough money to buy beer with or whatever. Just kind of lived a pointless life for that whole summer before I got drafted. Because I figured, hey, I'm toast, Well, I took a test. The Army gives batteries of tests, and I scored really high on the language test. They offered to send me to the Army Language School in Monterey, California. And I thought, that sounds like an okay deal. And they said, but you have to sign up for an extra year. If you were drafted and went in, it was a 2-year commitment. 2 years and you were done. I had to sign up for an extra year to qualify for the language school. Well, I did, and I found out that the language I was going to study was Polish. And I thought, that means I don't have to go to Vietnam, because I didn't think that they would send a Polish linguist to Vietnam. Now, the Army has done stupider things than that. It's a strange world. Catch-22, maybe some of you have read that. They just do things that don't seem to make any sense. But it kind of, I thought, meant that I would not have to go to Vietnam. A number of friends who did go to Vietnam, besides Tim O'Brien. And so let me just tell you about a couple of them. Greg went over there. He got in a firefight and he freaked out. He said he'd had enough, and he put his M16 on automatic, and he goes like that, and then he can fire, I don't know, just an unbelievable number of rounds a second, but he shot out his shin and his toe, and he was medevaced out, and he was then unfit for service. So that's how he got out once he was there. the traditional ways of getting out, if your number was below, say, 225, go to Canada. You could do that because Canada would grant you asylum. But that meant you couldn't come back. Then you were a traitor, and the United States would not let you come back if you fled to Canada. And along the Rainy River, that chapter, Tim O'Brien goes up there and he discusses that with the old man. Should I go to Canada? And decides ultimately that he's not going to go to Canada. You could get a physical deferment. You didn't have to shoot off your shin if you were still in this country, but if you had, like one of the students in one of the earlier classes had blown out his knee, his uncle had blown out his knee in football, so he was unfit to serve because he couldn't walk properly. So a medical deferment was one way to do that. You could try to get a graduate school deferment, and sometimes that worked to get 2 extra years, but if you graduated in 1969 or 1970, that didn't do you that much good because 2 more years and the war was still raging over in Vietnam, still hundreds of thousands of troops over there. So it was pretty hard to get out. Should I explain the conscientious objector thing? That got out very few people. I could have tried that because I was kind of a pacifist. I didn't hunt, even though my family hunted. I didn't like killing any of God's creatures. But basically what you had to do was swear that if your mother was being threatened and you had the opportunity to kill the person threatening your mother, would you kill that person? Well, you'd say yes, right? I mean, most of us would say yes. I would kill that person. Well, then you're not a conscientious objector. You don't believe that there are, you believe that there's at least some instances where it's okay to kill people. So they wouldn't grant you that. I think my draft board granted about 3 conscientious objector status during the term of the Vietnam War. One of those was a Quaker. Their religion is morally opposed to war, and so he had pretty good grounds to stand on. So anyway, it was pretty hard to get out of the draft if your number was low. Well, this created even more divisions in the society. Those of us who had low numbers think, why does he get out? Why does he get to go pursue his career? And, I have to go and serve. But again, I was kind of lucky. I ended up going to Germany where we were preparing to fight World War III. And this sounds like a joke maybe, but the Soviet Union at that time was a really, really powerful nation. They had almost as many nuclear weapons as we did. They had large land armies, huge numbers of tanks, and we really thought that there was a chance that they might try to gain more ground in Eastern Europe. They had already invaded 2 countries that had tried to separate themselves. Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 had tried to separate themselves from the Soviet sphere of influence, and the Soviet Union sent in tanks and brutally crushed it. So we were afraid. We didn't know how far they'd go. It's just kind of like the Ukraine situation right now. We're not sure how far Putin is going to go. Yes, ma'am?
Where are you stationed in
Munich.
Okay.
And I'll explain a little bit of that, okay, when we get just a little bit farther here. Well, let me explain it right now, what we were doing. Because there was tens of thousands of U.S. troops in Germany, thousands more in Italy, I think some in England, I believe. So we had a big presence there because there was a fear that there was going to, it's hard to believe now, but we thought that maybe there was going to be another major land war in Europe. And so what we did there, it was military intelligence. I was kind of low level. We would interview people who fled from behind what was called the Iron Curtain. That was the Soviet sphere of influence. They had divided the continent kind of in half. And there was the Soviet sphere and there was the Allied sphere, they call it, Britain, France, United States, Germany. And so people would flee from countries that were under communist control, like Czechoslovakia, Poland. That's why, as a Polish linguist, I got sent over there. I never interrogated anybody. Again, they sent me to 9 months of school, and I didn't get to use my Polish, but I made myself useful. They come from Romania, Bulgaria. Anyway, what would happen, we had U-2 spy planes were going over and taking pictures, but there was a new building, say, out here along, say, in Warsaw, maybe. Along this street, You know, there's a new street here that was built after World War II, and there's this big new warehouse that we see from the aerial photos. Well, what's going on there? Well, you know, maybe this is just a hypothetical situation, but maybe they'd say, well, they're making ball bearings there, or they're making ammunition, or, you know, we try to gather what these buildings were. And if we determined that that was a potential military target, we'd write a report that says, you know, they're making this, such and such a product there that could have military purposes. And I carried up to my friend, my roommate, who worked in another office upstairs, and he'd read the report and read the location, and on the map he'd put a red pin there. And the map had red pins all over the place, and those were bombing targets that were going to be bombed if World War III ever broke out in Europe. So that's what I did when I was in Europe. That was my mission over there. Kind of surreal. It's like Dr. Strange was, you know.
I just wanted to know, my dad later on was stationed in Oxford, so I wanted to...
Really? Okay. All right.
He was an intelligence student in Russia.
Yeah. Was he wasn't in the ASA, was he?
I don't know.
Okay. Because I had a friend, we've all heard about the NSA, right? That they're snooping, they're reading your email on Google and Yahoo, and you know, that they have just incredible capability to find out everything everybody is saying.
Contracting with private security contractors to put cameras on people's cars to track everybody that goes around, and then turning that data over to the government.
No, it's gone way too far. And it's kind of scary. You know, I mean, you watch the Hunger Games and you think, oh, maybe we're not that far away. You know, I hope they can rein it in. I really do. But I was gathering intelligence, and I had a friend who belonged to the ASA, the Army Security Agency. He had to enlist for 4 years to get that assignment. He did study Russian. He sat, you know, from here to the far trees there, away from the, he was in West Germany in a little village there where there were chickens running around in the yards, and he'd sit there with his headphones and he'd listen to what the Russians and the Germans were saying, you know, just a couple of miles away, trying to learn what they wanted to do. Were they really, you know, would they ever send tanks across the border? So, I mean, I do think you have to have some intelligence. You have to know what your enemies are doing. And unfortunately, in this world, we always have enemies. And Mrs. Fry told me that one of her classes reads a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. It's a brilliant book written by Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer from the New York Times. And he kind of speaks of war as an addiction. It's awful. You know, Tim O'Brien talks about the guy who went out to urinate, and he's turning around and he's zipping up his zipper, and boom, the sniper blows him away. He was zipped while zipping. I don't know if you remember that scene or not. You know, the other friend coming around the corner, and he's smiling one minute, the next minute he's hanging in pieces up in the tree. And it's just, you know, that's what war is like. It's just awful. I mean, if you see Saving Private Ryan, some of the things that happen in that opening scene are just hard to watch, but that's war. It's very realistic. Flags of Our Fathers is very realistic, tries to portray what war is really like. And that was part of the reason why there was so much opposition to the Vietnam War, because we were seeing war almost in real time. We see stuff that happened earlier in the day on the network news, and you're seeing soldiers getting carried off the battlefield on stretchers and put into helicopters, and you're seeing all the blood and the gore. Yeah.
With a retrospective point of view, do you feel like it was fair the way that the government portrayed the war towards you?
In Vietnam?
Yeah, like what they said.
The way the government portrayed it?
Yeah, like we need to fight the communists, it's great.
I disagreed with that. See, I thought the pretense was all wrong, and that's part of what was such a problem. You
So
know?
maybe with the media that was available to you, it helped you make a better decision?
I believe that people should serve their country. I really do. Just like in Israel, you know, where everybody has to serve 1 year either in the military or social service. I don't necessarily think, if you don't want to kill people, go help people who are, you know, underserved, you know, who have, you know, maybe need educational food needs, whatever, in Chicago, or, you know, help out in some way. Because I think this is still a great country. we're free. We have an incredible amount of freedom in this country and opportunity. So I don't think that you should just assume that that's always going to be there. So I don't regret serving, and actually being able to spend a year in Munich was just amazing. It's just an incredible city, and we were in civilian clothes since we were, intelligence, and we had nice apartments that they put us up in. So basically, the money that we made, which wasn't much, but we could use that to spend buying food in nice restaurants in Munich, or if we wanted to, we could travel down, into the Bavarian countryside, or go down to Starnberger, and beautiful, beautiful spot about a half hour outside of Munich. I mean, we had some really. One weekend we did a long weekend. We went down to northern Italy. So I mean, some good things happened to me because of my Army experience. I might not, if I, it's very, it shows how random life can be. My daughter is Mrs. Noner. Her mother's 5 years younger than I am. If I had not gone into the Army and had gone straight to law school, there's a very good chance that I would have never met her mother. Because I might have met somebody else, in the meantime. So it's just, simple twist of fate. I don't know. I disagree with the premise of the Vietnam War. I think it was wrong. And I think McNamara came out with a book and video saying that he realized that he was wrong in pushing that war. I think Lyndon Johnson came to believe that it was wrong to be involved in that war. But like Tim O'Brien says in the book, you can't make dead people undead. It's too late for the regrets at that point. So, are there some questions? I mean, I can talk probably a long, long time and ramble and stuff. Does anybody have a specific other? Yeah.
What did you do after the service?
I was very alienated, and Tim O'Brien talks about, how, we were regarded as outcasts. Why do you serve in the military? Well, because I was going to get drafted, and my number was low enough. Maybe yours wasn't. There was one of the good things that came out of the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam veterans worked hard. Respect the troops, support the troops. It's not their fault that we're there. They're doing what the government asks them to do. They didn't decide to go there. They may believe in it, they may not believe in it, but support the troops. And so I'm really happy because, believe me, there were no parades when we came back. You tried to disguise yourself. You tried to get in civilian clothes as fast as you could. The only problem was we had short hair, and all the guys at that point had long hair to identify themselves as, counterculture. So I got back and I tried to immerse myself in the counterculture as quickly as I could. I don't think I got a haircut for like 6 months. I had hair at that time, by the way, but I don't think I got a haircut for 6 months. I bought bell bottoms. I don't know if you've seen pictures of the Arrow, but patched bell bottoms. Tie-dye is coming back now, right? I don't know, I see it sometimes anyway, but that was all the rage at the time, so you buy tie-dye shirts. You just try to look as normal as you could. And it was about 5 years before I got a real job. Because I just didn't want to. I was just alienated and trying to figure out what life was all about. And so I took part-time jobs like bartending and waiter. I was a waiter for a while, good tips, So, all I needed was enough to pay the rent and to buy beer. And, it was just, I just wanted to become part of the counterculture because I just felt like a stranger in a strange land when I got back.
Okay.
So that was really a good question.
Yeah.
And Tim O'Brien kind of indicates that in his first book, If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home. That's an old basic training marching song. If I die in a combat zone, box me, ship me home. So you have songs to march to when you're in basic training. Yes?
So what was the difference in at-home culture between World War II, Vietnam, and the Iraq War?
In World War II, and my mother has told me about this, she stood by my dad all the way through it. She was very loyal. She waited for him to get home. And when when Tim O'Brien writes about Lieutenant with Martha, and he carries that picture of her around, and he hopes that she's in love with him, and he knows really that she's not, and he knows that she's not waiting for him. But I think during Vietnam, the tendency was, and I'm not saying it never happened, because it did, but the tendency was your significant other did not wait for you. In fact, he writes about one day when mail came, and this was when we didn't have email, it was long before email. So snail mail was very important. If you'd get a letter from your family, saying we hope you're doing all right, it was very, very meaningful to you. And he says, mail came. My girlfriend said she was traveling in Europe with her new boyfriend. I mean, how demoralizing. You're sitting there, and then just minutes later, their platoon gets fired on, and he's just read that his girlfriend has found a new boyfriend, and they're traveling in Europe. Hey, Vietnam, big deal, and he's getting fired at and might get killed any minute, It's just this wild, disparity in perception. Now, Afghanistan, the fact is that very small percentage of our society had skin in the game. During World War II, almost everybody had skin in the game. During Vietnam, a large percentage of the culture had skin in the game. They had a family member that was either drafted or serving, or a friend that was drafted or serving. And that was part of the reason why the protests were so broad, because if they believed the war was wrong, well, they didn't want their friends or their family having to serve over there, maybe get killed. So during Afghanistan and Iraq, it was an all-volunteer army, and the draft was eliminated partly because of the vast uproar during the Vietnam War. It was just politically untenable. They just couldn't justify it anymore to their constituents. And so it was such a small percentage of people. And so, I remember we were told after the start of this is after 9/11, I guess, and when we were going to send troops over to Afghanistan, go back and shop, support the economy. And it's like, in World War II, they restricted sugar and rubber and butter. They said you can't have some of these things because we need them for the war effort. Well, in Afghanistan and Iraq, they didn't put on an extra tax to help fight the war. They didn't restrict anything. It was just like, go ahead and live your happy life. Now, the news media, I think, did a good job of pointing out that we were at war. And again, I think largely thanks to the Vietnam veterans coming back and insisting the veterans there were at least thanked and appreciated, support our troops. Does that answer that question, do you think? Okay. Yeah. Yes?
I know that Lake Minnetonka, Bay Island was a place for Vietnam vets and people who were involved to go and kind of I don't know, it's I don't know if you ever heard about it or whatever.
I did not. This is news to me.
They went and they would go and live there, so.
Really?
Yeah, it'd be
So was this after the war, or?
Yeah, around, I think in 1979 to 86 or something like that.
Huh.
So, it's not there anymore, but yeah. I was wondering if you had ever gone.
I had not. I would have liked to have, and I didn't. That is totally new to me.
Yeah, if you go there, they tore down all the buildings and stuff. There's still park benches where they had engraved platoon numbers and stuff where they go and eat lunch and stuff.
Yeah. How many of you have ever been to Washington, D.C.? I heard there was a field trip. Some people went on. Did you see the wall when you were there?
Yeah.
What did you think of it?
I mean, I was in fifth grade, so I was pretty young, and I didn't know much about the war, but it was, I just remember how many names were on that wall.
58,000. And I've often wondered, how come I wasn't up there? I was kind of lucky. Tim O'Brien probably thinks, how come I'm not up there? I was kind of lucky. This is a book about the wall with pictures in it. Here's a group of young schoolgirls going there and looking at some of the stuff. People go there to find the name of a loved one or a relative or a friend that they know was killed in Vietnam. And they have a computerized database that tells you where it is, and it's arranged by years. And so you can go and you can find the name. And a lot of times you'll be walking along at the base of the wall and you'll find a pack of cigarettes and a note. these are for you, bud, or a can of beer. That'll be sitting there, or flowers, obviously. Sometimes people will write letters and put them there, and I've actually picked up some of those letters and read them, and it's just ripped your guts out. I mean, it's just like, sometimes to daddy or something like that. It's so moving. The National Park Service comes out at the end of every day and cleans them all up at the end of every day. So if you get there 5 in the morning or 6 or whenever they open it, there's nothing. It's just the wall. And so start just with 58,000 names. They still are adding names to the wall because they're still finding and identifying remains of people who were missing in action. So if you ever go there, it's a very spiritual experience to walk along there and just think of what the emotional impact was on the people whose names are up there. And, yes?
Have your perspectives on war changed at all ever since you
Oh, wow, that's really a good question. I think about war a lot, and I have a friend who I try to write, and this friend is a very good musician. He's trying to get me to write a libretto about war. I told him if I do it, one of the lines I will use will be Chris Hedges' line, "War is a force that gives us meaning." And, like in the Bible it says there will be wars and there will be rumors of wars. And, I think it's just awful. And why can't we talk our way out of these things? Why can't we share more so that I don't have to fight to get what you've got? And yet it just seems like it's a gene that we have. It's still evolving, even if, how old I am, it's still evolving. That's a brilliant question, and, I think that's why I like the book by Chris Hedges, because it kind of explores that. Why do we do that? So that's I wish I could give you a firmer answer, but still trying to figure it out. Yeah.
What was the difference between Europe and the war? They, for the most part, weren't involved.
I knew that I had friends that were over there. I was very aware that it was going on. I was very aware that some people were dying, that could have been me. I didn't think, just because I was in Germany, I didn't think, well, I'm not killing anybody, because I'm filling a slot that had to be filled so that somebody else could fill a slot in Germany. So I still felt like I was part of the war machine. Much of Europe did not like the Vietnam War. France, in fact, had tried to fight in Vietnam, and they had been routed by the same, I think it was called the Viet Minh when France was fighting it, and then they were routed at Dien Bien Phu in, I think, 1954, I think was the date of that. So they withdrew. France had a huge presence in all of Southeast Asia prior to that, and that was kind of the end of their presence in Southeast Asia. So they had already tried that trick and figured out it didn't work. The Europeans did not like the war, in my experience. They thought it was stupid. Or wrong, maybe stupid is the wrong word, but they didn't think it was a right idea. Yeah?
How does it make you feel to read that people who were recently deployed that are veterans that don't have the medical care that they need are delayed by the VA?
I think it's terrible.
What makes you feel that?
Yeah, I think that veterans should get every benefit that is due to them. They put a lot on the line.
Nail for everything.
Yeah, I think that's awful. And I know it's partly a question of money, and money is always being debated. But I think veterans should get everything that they were promised, because they agreed to offer their life in exchange.
They made a blank check.
Yeah, there you go. Very good.
Payable up to for every amount of their life.
Very good. Yeah, I think it's awful, and I hope they rectify that rapidly. Yes, that's a super question.
What are your thoughts on sensationalizing the war? What the benefits and setbacks of war sensationalism?
Well, I don't know that war needs to be sensationalized. I mean, it's just, it's just an awful thing if you show what's happening. There might be a political question, because there's no question at all that the publicizing of the Vietnam War by the media, which was done to an extent that had never been done in any war previously, undermined the war effort. When people saw images like this nightly on their television screen, a village that had been torched and burned to the ground, and people are fleeing, and you were seeing that daily in the news. You're seeing our soldiers getting medevaced from the battlefield. So it's a political question. Does it undermine the effort? If the news media is doing it just to gain...
Just a reminder of the Women's Ensemble concert tonight, or was that
That answer?
at 7:30?